Prince William addresses the protagonist as Constance von Leffer, aka Lady Highland. The prince says he no longer wants to marry the protagonist because he has learned what true love is. The prince asks Constance to break off their engagement. The protagonist does not understand what the prince has just said. After all, only a moment ago the protagonist was happy that His Highness wanted to talk to her. Constance must go to the prince now. His Highness always holds himself with such dignity that Constance can only see him when he calls her to his bedroom. Constance was so worried when she heard the prince had something to say to her. But now she hears that the prince is talking about true love. Constance asks, "Has His Highness William cheated on her? After all, there is nothing lower than that." William replies that they have had nothing yet, but their feelings are so intoxicating they can't ignore them. Wilhelm begins to call a girl named Sylvia into the room. When the girl enters the room, Constance sees that this girl is a saint. Sylvia is a saint that has done many miracles and saved many people. She is valuable to this country. Constance realizes that even though William is the crown prince of the country, she doesn't understand how a prince can raise his hand on a saint. Sylvia approaches His Highness and asks if he's okay. After all, Wilhelm is breaking off his and Constance's engagement. Constance senses that the prince is doing something terrible. But Wilhelm hugs the girl and talks about how Sylvia is very nice, that she even cares about the other girl's feelings. But there is not much to worry about here. After all, the prince did not love the girl from the beginning. Now Constance can't understand how the prince never loved her. After all, despite how many times they've shared the same bed, he can't help but love her. Constance says she understands how the prince could fall in love with a beautiful saint. After all, the girl has miraculous powers. But Constance is his fiancée. The protagonist was devoted to him and gave her body and heart to him. But now the prince is breaking their engagement. The prince says that such things worry him the least. After all, Constance said she gave him her body and heart, loved the girls that are given to him so easily. He says that it is only by his will that Constance is so sad. The main character walks up to the guy and punches him in the face. Constance gave herself to the prince with her whole heart and body. She only did it for the prince. Constance really loved him, and yet this traitor has abandoned her. Sylvia begins to apologize to His Highness. She says it was all her fault. But the prince tells Sylvia not to worry, because now they know who Constance really is. And the prince can bear to be treated so cruelly. The prince is glad because he didn't hurt Sylvia. The protagonist begins to realize that it is true, and Wilhelm's heart no longer belongs to her. The protagonist turns around and leaves. She says she has realized that if the prince has already decided that Saint Sylvia is the right girl for him, then there is no point in the protagonist staying at the palace. After all, even if it is a marriage of convenience, there must be some love in it. And now with the prince, the protagonist is an outsider. Constance won't cry, and if she cries now, she will only become even weaker. After the protagonist returns from her audience with His Highness, the girl sleeps all the time. The maids are discussing the fact that Constance must have been shocked by the breaking of the engagement. After all, it means that the girl can no longer stay in the palace. The maids will miss the girl. After all, they love her very much. And Constance had been very kind to her maids. Perhaps it was for shock, but Constance fell asleep very soundly and dreamed. It must have been one thing, from a memory of her past life. There was an economic crisis, and the only place Constance could get a job was a company that exploited its employees. The girl was on the last train home, and she was almost 30 years old. But she had no time for relationships in her life. The only outlet for the main character was a series of books, which she read to the whole and learned by heart. It's called The Saint Who Saved Her Country. There are only 3 volumes. The main character is a commoner from a poor country. One day she realizes she has powers and becomes a saint. With the help of these holy powers, she protects the country and gives happiness to the citizens, and to top it off, she has several handsome men in love with her. And her happy ending comes when she marries the crown prince. Real life was so difficult for the main character that this typical romance story was her only salvation. The girl could quote chapters and even dream about her every book. Now Constance realizes it's just a dream from her past life. She doesn't understand if it's reincarnation. She has the same face as Constance. that girl from Saint that saved her country. This girl was a typical villain and a third wheel. She was the crown prince's bride, who was mercilessly mocked by all the female characters who got close to the prince. The main character sits in front of a mirror and starts crying. She is surprised to be reborn as a character in the book, but she also can't believe that she is Constance the villain. After all, many readers hate her with all their souls. But Constance is not a bad person. She was born into a noble family. She had responsibility for all the roles assigned to her, and she did as well as she could. Constance has been with the crown prince for the last 2 years as if she were his wife. And yet she was forced to be the villain. What's even sadder is that the main character is treated so unfairly just to add some spice to their romance. Constance realizes that if the engagement is broken, it means they're somewhere near the end of the first volume, and after that, the struggle for Sylvia's hand and heart still will not subside. In volumes 2 and 3, Sylvia has such an intense personal life that Constance only appears in flashbacks to make the story more exciting. The protagonist doesn't realize whether or not she knows that Constance has an unscripted life. At this point, the protagonist's maid walks in and sees that Constance is finally awake. The girls bring her herbal tea. Constance realizes that she can live her life. She thanks the maid for the tea and says she will have some. Constance says that even though it's a bit rushed, she's leaving the palace. Constance will return to her parents. She asks if she can therefore ask the maids to pack her things. After all, Constance has decided to live a life of freedom. And in this case, she will survive and live the life of a villain. After a while, the protagonist is already in the carriage. She thinks that in the carriage, shabby as it is, she does not need to fear that she will be robbed. She mentally says goodbye to her palace. And she also mentally says goodbye to her former lover. The girl starts to cry, but she tries to calm herself down and says it's okay. After all, to survive, she needs to write down everything she remembers from the holy that saved her country. After all, if the protagonist got into the world of the book she read in her past life, she has an advantage. She no longer wants to be dictated to by the prince and Sylvia. And if Constance writes everything she remembers, there must be some problematic moments she can avoid. Suddenly, the protagonist is approached and asked if Lady Constance is hot. It's a chaperoned guy in the name of Isaac. Constance replies that she is fine and the wagon is cool. She says Isaac is the only one who needs to be careful, because the sun. It's scorching today. Isaac thanks Miss for her concern. The boy's doing his best to protect the girl, so Constance can return to her parents' house with peace of mind. The protagonist thanks the guy for that. Isaac is a talented knight who worshipped the protagonist in loyalty, but Constance remembers that she has to write it down. After all, Isaac will also be one of Sylvia's potential suitors. At this time, Prince William and Sylvia are looking out the window. The prince says that the obstacles have finally been removed and Constance can start living there today. He calls the girl his favorite. Sylvia thanks His Highness, but it seems to her that Lady Constance was very depressed. The protagonist has already arrived at the house of the Marquis of Highland. The girl welcomes in her house. The maids are happy to see the protagonist. They say that Constance must be tired after such a long journey. They ask that Constance come in as soon as possible. Constance is overjoyed that she is home at last, for she has not been here for 2 years, and nothing has changed since she left the mansion. Constance left this house 2 years ago, full of joy, and her lover needed her. Now it's just a pity because of the homecoming, especially when the engagement of the protagonist is broken. The only thing that's changed here is Constance. I mean, that's what it looks like. Isaac turns to the protagonist asking, "Is there something wrong with Lady Constance?" But Constance replies that there is nothing wrong. She offers to go and greet her father now. If the protagonist follows the story, her father has disowned her. Or did he still place the dignity of his title on his daughter, who was stripped of her chastity and honor and before he was banished? For the protagonist's father, whose family has served the royal family for generations, it's an incredible disgrace. And it makes sense that Constance was disowned. The protagonist meets her father. The father sees Constance standing in front of him. The heroine says she is sorry because her engagement to the prince has been broken off. Constance sees that her father is very angry. But at that moment, out of the blue, the father approaches the protagonist and begins to hug her, saying that it is not his daughter's fault. The father says that he has received reports from the spies he has placed in the palace. Constance was perfect in her role, but still her engagement was broken off. And that was the prince's fault. It is not his daughter's fault. Constance doesn't understand why her father doesn't abuse her. She's the villain for being abandoned by the protagonist. In theory, her father should have disowned her. She failed. Constance doesn't understand. Isn't that the story? To the father. It's a shame his daughter had to go through so much. After all, if he'd known the prince was so bad, he never would have agreed to the engagement. And the girl was sent home. Constance asks if her father will forgive her, but her father says there's nothing to forgive the girl for. And in fact, he is very sorry that he made his only daughter suffer so much. He is the one who starts to ask the protagonist for forgiveness. Constance begins to cry. She sees that her father loves her very much. Constance hugs her father. The protagonist loves her father, the Marquis of Highland. Her father tells his daughter to forget everything and rest for a while. At this point, Constance wants to ask her father for something. She asks that the father disown his daughter to spare her family and send her away from Highland. When the father hears this, he's shocked. He asks what the daughter's talking about. Constance says the Marquis of Highland has the most influence after the royal family and the crown prince. It's an eternal confrontation between them. And it would be good if the protagonist became a bridge between the royal family and them. But after everything that happened, there will be problems. It's not like the events in the novel are real. Constance says that if the story is fabricated, so that the engagement was broken through her fault, then there's a possibility that it could be a problem for the whole marquisate, and in that case, the girl must figure out how to protect her father in Highland. The father asks, does Constance want him to pretend to disown his daughter, to show the royal family that they knew her from the marquisate, and that they no longer care about the daughter, using the engagement as a reason? Constance thinks this is the best choice. After all, she doesn't want to be the cause of a blow to her father because it doesn't matter how small that blow is. Her father replies that there is no need to fear the royal family, but he wonders what Rain will do after the abdication. After all, she won't be able to be in the capital. Constance says that actually she got some lands as reparation for breaking the engagement in a remote area, and it's a good opportunity for her to go. At this point, Isaac says that if his father will allow it, he would like to go with the girl. The father sees that he has one of the best Highland knights in front of him. Constance says that she will feel more comfortable if Isaac goes with her, but she asks if the knight is sure. After all, it is a long way away. Isaac replies that his job is to protect Lady Constance, and wherever in the capital or in the center of the earth, he is ready to go along with the protagonist. After some time, Constance is ready to set off along with her, and the knight Isaac goes with her. The father sees his daughter off, saying that if she wants to come back, she is always welcome in this place. The maid asks Lady Constance to be careful. Constance says goodbye to everyone, and Isaac says it's time to go. As the protagonist and the knight set off, Constance thinks about the fact that this is the beginning of her new life, and she is not going to follow the path written for her. She is going to live her life, doing what she wants to do. After some time on the road, Constance sees that they are approaching Balth's territory. Constance sees that it is indeed hinterland, and it looks like the lonely island even though it is on land. There's nothing there but mountains and ocean, and it's extremely difficult to trade there. Constance realizes it's no wonder it was given away so easily. But now everything here belongs to her, and she will do everything possible to develop these lands. At this moment, the knight Isaac addresses the protagonist and says that they have reached the top of the pass and the whole region can be seen from here. He asks if Constance would like to come out and take a look at it. Constance, of course, agrees they go out and look. Isaac asks that when Constance gets out of the carriage, she should look under her feet. The protagonist thanks the knight. The girl looks into the distance and realizes that this appears to be the deep forest. She hasn't seen anything more beautiful than this. Isaac also says it's a beautiful sight, and there are no forests like this in the capital. But Constance hears that the boy is already used to the capital. Isaac replies that it's true that his city is on the border, but they don't have thick forests. Constance starts laughing and talks about how it was a joke. But the knight is right. After all, such untouched nature proves that this is indeed a valuable piece of earth. Constance thinks about the fact that she was betrayed by her lover and abandoned. For the protagonist, it is painful and offensive, but thanks to this, she got this wonderful land. And the girl is sure that after something bad always comes good. Isaac says that Lady Constance thinks right, and now he and Lady will have only good things to happen. Isaac assures the protagonist of that. He hopes so too. But when the protagonist looks at the knight, she realizes that one day Isaac will leave her and love Sylvia. The next day, the life of the protagonist landowner began. However, the girl does not have much experience in this, and she does not know where to start. To the protagonist came Isaac and turns to Lady Sophia. He says that the Marquis sent a city official to work for his daughter Constance, does not understand what her father did. After all, it would really help. At that moment, a guy walks into their office and asks permission to introduce himself. He's a guy named Alois. Constance has heard good things about the guy's work in the administration. It's nice to meet him. But at that moment, Alois puts a huge stack of papers on the table in front of the girl and says that although it's unexpected, the city is in great danger. He asks Constance to please look at these documents, because it is obvious that the economy of these lands is not the best. And Alois would not be surprised if everything collapses tomorrow. Constance realizes that even though the guy is so young, he must have checked all this in the last few days. Constance says that Alois is exactly as they say he is. The guy turns to Lady Sophia, talking about how her father made a wonderful deal with him and he's obligated to do it. The brilliant official Alois and the best of the knights. Isaac are wonderful people who have come such a long way for the protagonist, and Constance is very grateful to them. Alois realizes that even though Constance says that everyone has just abandoned the land, but it looks like the previous owner cheated, and all because of the royal family's negligence. Isaac has heard that this land is like the Lonely Island, and there's a lot of natural disasters. On top of that, there's corruption among the officials. Constance says that the royal family no longer owns these lands, and from now on, these are her lands. She decides to show the people that things will change today. She asks if she can count on the boys to help her. Alois says that of course the lady can count on it, because he is Alois Burl, and he will do everything he can to make it happen. Isaac swears on his life to Lady Constance. After all, he is her faithful servant. He asks that Miss Constance order him to do whatever she wants. Constance says she has the first order for the two of them. She tells the boys to just call her by her first name, and now they are forbidden to call her lady. Isaac replies that even though it's a girl's order, he can't do it. Alois asks if it's possible that the girl has a plan. Constance says that Alois is very perceptive, and in fact, she wants to survey the land. In order to improve the place and revitalize the economy, the protagonist must face reality. For no matter how many reports she reads, there are things that will be overlooked. Only the nobles and some diplomats know that Constance has become the head of this land. And now is the only chance she has to look around since the locals are so far afraid of her existence. Everyone will put on their best behavior in front of her when they find out who she is. And it won't make sense. That's why Constance doesn't want for guys to address her by her title. She says they should just call her by her first name. Alois says Constance is right. After all, there's no one in town who can compete on their own. Addressing the girl might divide them in a bad way. However, Alois says that he cannot accompany the girl. After all, today there are documents that he and sort out. Constance thinks there is nothing to be done about it. She asks what about Isaac. The knight replies that of course he will go, because his job is to protect the lady. So he will certainly go wherever Constance decides to go. Constance is angry because she just told the knight to call her by her first name. Constance sees that Isaac is too serious. The protagonist thinks she needs to tease the guy a little. She asks if Isaac heard what she said since a knight should call her by her name. Alois asks, has Isaac never done a flexibility exercise since he has spent his whole life training his body? Constance says that time is of the essence and they must get ready to set off. The main character has been changed into simple clothes, and she likes it very much. The girl who changed the main character says it looks beautiful. Constance says that this dress is very light, and she didn't realize that the local dresses of Meladorphia would be so light. Constance is surprised at how comfortable it is around her waist. After all, since Constance was always required to wear a corset with her dresses, she remembered it as something natural. But maybe it was something that restricted her and pressured the girl. For throughout her life, Constance, once sworn allegiance to the crown prince as his bride, Constance would rather be free than bound by love to a traitor. It's much better for the protagonist to have freedom and a future like this. Knight Isaac knocks on the door and asks if he can come in. The knight says he is ready. The boy is also changed and asks when they will be on their way. Constance is surprised at how handsome the boy is. After all, this is the first time she sees Isaac without knight's armor. They set off on their journey. The day of the visit to the city arrives. The protagonist knight went to the bazaar. Now Constance understands how people live here. She sees how active the children are, and it reminds her of her previous life. After all, Constance took the last train every day, but went shopping on rare weekends. The working-class shopping rows were similar, and Constance was surprised when she realized she had been reborn as a villain. Plus, when the engagement was cancelled, Constance felt that she was about to collapse from the suddenness of pain and unhappiness. But now Constance was no longer trapped in a past life, or in the determination of a new one. She can go out into the city, and also the protagonist can dress however she wants and walk around happily free. Constance feels the way she is happy. At this moment, the knight Isaac turns to Miss Constance, and Constance asks what happened. But Isaac replies that nothing because he thought Constance had said something. The protagonist is confused because it seems the knight heard her talking to herself. The protagonist tells Isaac not to worry and that she's just having fun. Isaac wants Constance to always be smiling. The knight just thought the protagonist was still in pain. The protagonist doesn't understand what the knight is talking about, but she asks that Isaac not tell her. Does he really think she's still reeling from the breaking of the engagement? Constance isn't really bothered by this pain, and she's glad it happened. Isaac says that Constance shouldn't force herself to pretend in front of her. After all, the knight is sure he can protect the girl from anyone who tries to harm her in any way. But her heart. It's the one thing he can't protect. But Isaac will do anything to make the girl better. Isaac is willing to do that. Constance never expected Isaac to speak so fervently. Constance doesn't understand what's going on. The protagonist interjects. Would the knight really do anything? Constance thinks about whether this could mean that Isaac feels something for her, but Constance asks the knight directly what it means. At this point, Isaac kneels down and says that he respects Miss Constance. Isaac says that his sword is to the lady and only to her. Constance realizes what this means. It's true, Isaac is a serious knight, and it's impossible for him to fall in love with his lady. Constance realizes that the knight is not interested in her, and he just wants to be a knight to Constance von Leffer, the lady of these lands. Constance says she will go ahead, because she knew this one, but she doesn't understand why her heart is so tight. She thanks the boy. The protagonist will have to, because she's going to promote Isaac to Knight of the Land. She'll make sure the knight can't leave her or the town. Isaac says he'll be happy to accept the position. After all, he will do whatever Miss Constance wishes. The protagonist sees the smile Isaac has on his face, and she ends up finding her sweet. But at that moment, the protagonist notices something falling. At that moment, a nearby peddler says that they call it snowflakes. These are the kind of bugs that come down to the city by the wind from the northern mountain range at this time of year when they come down to the city. When one insect falls on the girl's hand, Constance sees that it is indeed a bug, for she has never seen one before. The man asks, "Has the girl really not seen one?" He asks, "Have the two of them really just arrived?" Constance says they're just traveling, but that's a big lie. The man says this happens a lot in the city. These insects are cute, but they're harmful. After all, their fluff gets stuck in merchandise and in laundry, and they can't be cleaned out. On the other hand, the more snow color, the warmer it is in the winter. So that's a good thing. There are more of these insects this year, so it will be warm. And that's good. When it's cold in this place, a lot of people die. Constance thanks the merchant for telling her everything. She realizes it's really hard in the countryside. Since she has chosen to live here, she must work hard to prepare for winter. Constance turns to the knight and tells him that no matter what happens, he must be there. What happens, he must be at her side. Isaac replies that of course he will. After all, he will be at his mistress's side for her protection for the rest of his days. Now he suggests that we continue to look around. The protagonist wonders if Isaac will say the same when winter comes. For in the novella, this winter Isaac will fall in love with Saint Sylvia, who will be on a purification trip. And then the knight will leave her. After a while, the Alloys start screaming that this is terrible, for they have received word that another monster has appeared in the north, and now they're taking a lot of damage, and many people have already died. Constance turns to the knight, and she says that Isaac told her that he would follow her anywhere. The knight replies that this is certainly true. He will go wherever Constance wishes. Constance thanks the knight and tells Bones to stay in this place and watch over the manor. Alois asks that Constance only not say that she is going there. The protagonist replies that she and Isaac are heading north. After all, she can't count on the saint, and it's past time for her to get rid of the monster on her own. Meanwhile, Alois is trying to deal with the delicate flowers. Constance told me, when she was in town, these insects are unusually abundant this year, and it looks like this year will be warmer than usual. Isaac apologizes to Miss Constance, but he says that may be the case. Be true. But the winters are still so Suvarovian that people are dying, and they can't get ahead of themselves. Constance realizes that it's true they should prepare for winter as thoroughly as possible starting today without letting their guard down. Constance has decided to live in this place, so she has to do her job as leader, to do what she can for the boys. After all, they have to take care of the lives of their residents first. Alois is glad to hear Constance feels that way, but they need the means to do that. After all, Alois mentioned it earlier, but Meldorf's finances are very limited. Constance says that they should then cancel her inauguration and the celebratory banquet, and those funds should be used to prepare for winter and fight crime. And if it's not enough to cover the expenses of a city that covers a large enough area, the girl gives the boy the key to the vault. Constance leaves the disposition of the money to the boy. Alois says that Constance has put everything on the line. The protagonist replies that these finances she received from the royal family, and they were not originally her money, so she wants to use it for her own town. Alois thought that the aristocracy always valued their careful excess of everything. Alois is very proud to serve a lady like Constance. After the meeting to fund Alois, the remaining problems will most likely be from the life of a saint who will protect her country. The appearance of monsters will make them ask for help, about the saint who will purify them, and after Isaac must leave her. The knight turns to the protagonist and asks, "Is something wrong?" Constance apologizes and says nothing happened. Isaac asks, "Is the girl tired from the trip to the city?" But Constance replies that everything is fine. At this point, the protagonist is walking up the stairs and she stumbles. The protagonist's foot slips and she starts to fall. At that moment, she is caught by the knight. The knight sees that the protagonist's face is flushed and he offers to escort the girl to her room. But Constance says that it is not worth it and the guy should leave her alone. After all, she can make it on her own. Since that day, if there is anything Constance can do for the good of the people, she will. The protagonist will gladly accept it. At that moment, Alois approaches the protagonist. Constance asks what's wrong since Alois is agitated. The guy replies that they have just received a letter from the manager of the northern region. Constance takes the letter and starts to read it. It says that monsters have appeared in the northern mountain range, and the girl asks for help. Constance realizes that the time has come. She asks how much damage the monsters have already done. Alois replies that the damage is equal to the money to prepare for winter. But a lot of foresters went to the mountains to prepare for winter and disappeared. Constance tells Alois to hurry up and order the villagers to evacuate and prepare soldiers. After all, the mountain is now forbidden. Also, humans won't be able to stand up to the monsters. The only ones who can stand up to them are the saints. I'm telling Alois to send a request to the palace because they need Saint Sylvia. She must purify. It's a monster. Constance realizes that even if she loses Isaac in the end, she must protect her land. A messenger arrives from the royal palace a month after they sent the request. The messenger says that it took a long time, and he addresses Lady Sophia and says that he is glad to see her in good health. Constance says the messenger took too much time, she asks. When will Saint Sylvia arrive? The messenger says that both Saint Sylvia and the Crown Prince are now on their way to clear the southern lands, so it will be a little while before they arrive. Constance realizes that this man, when she was at the palace, did everything to please her. But after the engagement was broken off, he lost interest in her abruptly. To have a man like him as an envoy was beneath her. Constance asks that the messenger listen. She says they cannot delay. The damage is only growing, and every day the soil gets worse and her citizens are suffering. Constance says she needs the messenger to ask the king for help as soon as possible. The messenger says that they are well informed of the situation, and yet it seems that cleansing the southern domains is also quite difficult. After all, neither Saint Sylvia nor the prince can leave the region yet. At this point, Alois turns to Lady Sophia and says that he has seen what happened in the south. The boy hands the girl a letter, and Constance becomes angry. In the southern lands is a beautiful villa. As soon as they finished defending the south, Saint Sylvia and the prince and the other suitors for her hand are hiding on vacation. Constance realizes that this does indeed fit the novel. But it turns out she said it out loud. Alois interjects. What did the lady say? But Constance replies that it was nothing. In her past life, she thought it was wonderful that Saint Sylvia was adored by so many men. But now that Constance is in charge of the region, it's a terrible situation. And the lives of her citizens are on the line. And Sylvia is disappearing with a lot of men. The messenger appeals to the lady, but Constance screams that it's a waste of her time, and as soon as the messenger returns, he must tell the prince and the saint to end their vacation. Constance turns to the knight and tells him that the messenger is on his way out. She asks that the lad show the messenger the way out. Isaac agrees to the lady's words and escorts the messenger out. The protagonist knows the affair. That should be her trump card. She needs to remember because there must be a clue in the book. Something she can do without relying on the power of the saint. Constance doesn't understand. There's nothing she can do on her own. At this point, Alois comes to the protagonist and talks about how terrible it is. After all, they received a message that another minister appeared in the north and the damage is huge. A lot of people have already died. Constance realizes that it's time for them to get rid of the monsters with their own forces. The protagonist and the knight have already collected from the warriors and they are ready to set off. Constance sees that these soldiers will escort them north as an anti-monster force. Constance is surprised that there are so many warriors. Isaac would have preferred to gather more soldiers, but they were in a hurry. Constance says that is enough. She asks nothing that they will go on such a dangerous campaign. Isaac replies that it is all right. After all the soldiers who are gathered here are training to serve Lady Constance. No one here has any fear of danger. Now he suggests that they all go north. Constance realizes that only the saint can clear the monsters, and no matter how trained the fighters are, Isaac has assembled. They're all ordinary people. She doesn't realize if they can do the damage with just arrows. But Constance is the lady of these lands, and she can't run away from trouble. She can trample the hopes of Isaac and his troops. When they follow the protagonist put their lives on the line, Constance must make sure they achieve results. As they approach the northern region, Constance feels the way she is cold, for the snow is very deep, and in Balta it was still fall. But here it is a harsh winter. Isaac turns to all the warriors and says that they must rest in this place before entering the northern region. They pitch their tents and build a fire. During this time, Constance is warming herself. Suddenly, someone calls out to her, and it turns out to be the knight Isaac. He holds out a cup to the girl and tells Constance to let her drink some warm liquor if she wishes. Constance thanks the guy. Isaac asks how the girl is feeling. Constance says it's a lot cooler than expected, but she's fine. Isaac is glad to hear that. Constance asks how far it is to their destination. Isaac replies that the closest place to the area corrupted by monsters is 1/2 mile up in the mountains, and because it's in the mountains, there will be no flat land there. It will be the most dangerous area. And maybe it's inappropriate, but if they have to go back, now this. But Constance answer that they won't do that. And she tells the knight to leave because she's in charge. Isaac says the lady's decision is unwavering, and he understands. Then he asks that Constance to accept a gift from him. He holds out a necklace to the girl. Constance asks what it is. The knight tells her that it is an amulet that wards off misfortune that is passed on by inheritance in his family. He's heard that the saint prayed on it hundreds of years ago. The knight may not make the lady feel better, but he wants her to have it. Tell her she can't accept something like this. After all, it's one of the guy's family heirlooms. Constance says that Isaac should be the one to wear this amulet, but Isaac replies that it's not, because it's Lady Sophie's and he wants her to have it. The knight approaches the girl and says that he wants to keep the protagonist safe at all costs. After all, his dream is to stand by the girl's side as long as he lives. At this point, the knight rises up, turns around, and leaves. He tells everyone to get ready to leave. The girl thinks to herself about how extremely loyal knights can be so troublesome. They say things as meaningful as a declaration of love so easily. Constance can't get it wrong, then Isaac falls in love with the saint. The protagonist is told that the snow will only get deeper. The carriage will not be able to go any farther, so they must go on foot. At that moment, Constance gets out of the carriage and says she's understood. They set off on foot. Constance is surprised that there is so much snow. Isaac asks if the protagonist is all right. If she wants, he can carry her on his back. Constance replies that she will pass since she is not a child. Constance realizes that it is her job to protect her citizens and her land, and she must do her best. After some time, Isaac tells her that they have arrived. Constance rejoices that it has finally happened. At that moment, Mr. Isaac is called for help. The knight asks what happened. They don't understand what is going on there. After all, the ice has disappeared, and there's a puddle. Constance asks if the monster could have done all this. They don't understand how it happened. One of the warriors says that according to the local forester, monsters and miasmas started spreading from a crevice in the sacred mountain, and all the inhabitants were buried under the unclean. Constance had no idea the damage was so severe, and it's horrible. Plus, it's growing every day more and more. The local militia has done. It's all they can do, but it can't be stopped by ordinary people. They can only hope for a miracle. Constance realizes it's true. The only one who can stop it all is a saint. If she had performed the purification ceremony right away, no one would have died. Instead, those two, William and Sylvia, are on vacation in the Southlands. That land was devastated so badly, and so many people died. But they chose their desires over their wishes. At this point, Isaac says that this thing stinks horribly. It really does. All the other wars say it stinks to them too, but Constance doesn't understand what they're talking about. I mean, the guys say it stinks, and she can't smell anything. Constance asks what it's like. One of the warriors says it smells like rot, like missing fish and meat mixed together. The knight has never smelled anything worse before. He tries to hold back his nausea. Isaac turns to Lady Sophia to ask if it bothers her. Can't she smell the stench that comes from the filth? But Constance replies that she can't smell anything at all. All she can smell is the forest and snow. She asks if it could be because of the necklace her boyfriend gave her. But Isaac replies that it's not because of him. Rather, it's luck. After all, it was blessed by a saint a long time ago. Isaac doubts that it has any power left in it. Constance doesn't understand why it happened then. Sometimes people's senses can be dulled when you're sick, but Constance is really healthy. Then she doesn't understand what that means. She has to check it out. At this point, the protagonist starts to run, and Isaac tries to stop her. He says it's dangerous and not Constance shouldn't go there. At this point, the protagonist kneels down in front of the strange liquid and takes it in her hands. And Constance says that she knew what it was. Isaac asks what Mrs. Constance is doing. He asks that she leave this place now. She must not touch this. When Constance picked this up and she sees that Isaac can't touch it, Constance knew that this is a deviation from the original novel that only happened to her. That and who was reborn in this world. If that's the case, if she's the villainess also has the power of purification, it's probably not as strong as the saints. But she can protect this land without waiting for her. Alois says it's impossible. When the protagonist and the army returned from the north, Constance reported everything that happened to Alois. Of course, Constance didn't mention that she was reborn. Alois don't understand why only Lady Constance could have to touch the unclean. But he is sure of the fact that she can't purify monsters with her powers on her own. When the saint simply approaches tainted lands, her power grants divine protection to all who stand near her. Plus, it's completely natural. The protagonist knows this because she was the only one who was okay. Isaac and the other soldiers were under the influence of the profanity. This means that Constance can't replace the saint. The power that only works on her is completely useless. The protagonist starts to cry, but Isaac comes up to her. He says that there's nothing to be sad about, and even if she doesn't have the power as a saint, Constance is endowed with qualities that leaders need. The protagonist thanks the guy for saying that. The girl has memories from her past life, and she is the only one who knows the novel that this world is made of. And so, Constance thought she had special powers that was only once. But it was nothing to think so. Constance isn't special at all. She should at least try to survive until the saint arrives. The protagonist talks about how she realizes she should think about something if she doesn't have the right powers. She suggests thinking about other goals. But at that moment, a guard unexpectedly walks in and tells them that there is great news. They are done with the relocation of the people of the North. Constance replies that this is wonderful. But suddenly she remembers and asks if Alois didn't say it would take a long time. Alois is sure it's because of the way Constance shipped the northern lands. The former noblewoman who grew up in the city wore the national Meldorf clothing and marched soldiers despite the blizzard and did her best to face the monsters. Alois says it inspired people who had already given up, and it's all thanks to Lady Constance. Constance says Alois is just flattering her because she didn't do anything wrong. But Alois says the lady did, because the royal family has ignored these lands. Their arrogant and condescending behavior and their dismissive attitude towards Lady Constance. Alois doesn't understand how scum like them could do such a thing. But Constance tries to stop the guy. She says he shouldn't talk about the royal family like that. But Alois asks, does Constance really want him to respect the disgusting people who played with Sophia and then kicked him out? He says, does he really have to forgive the trash who hurt the lady so deeply? Alois can't do that, plus rumors have reached him that the reason for the dissolution and the engagement was wrong of the girl. Constance replies that she will never forgive that. She asks that Alois threatened to say such a thing. Alois follows Lady Constance's instruction. The protagonist asks that Alois please do so because she cannot influence the guy's decision, but she wants Alois to be respectful even if he is not. After all, only the saint will be able to cleanse the land. And soon she and the crown prince will arrive to help them. The protagonist offers to show them all hospitality for the sake of their own citizens. Everyone knows that even if she has no powers, it doesn't matter how pathetic it is. She has no other choice but to rely on the prince and the saint. At this time, the prince and the saint are riding in a carriage. Sylvia asks why she has to go somewhere now since she was enjoying her vacation. The prince says that they received a request for help from Meldorf at the beginning of the summer, and they will be there soon, so he asks the saint to wait. Saint is surprised at the place they have to head to. Wilhelm says it's the very town that Constance is in charge of. Wilhelm says that Sylvia has no problem saying no if she doesn't like it. I understand they have to go as soon as possible, and it looks like a lot more fun awaits them than they had on vacation. One day, monsters appear and take over the land, killing people along the way. Humans are powerless against them, and the only one who can destroy the monsters is a saint. But when the world needed Saint Sylvia, she took her turn partying with the crown prince and other guys. And after a couple months of asking for help, they finally arrived. When the prince and saint's carriage arrived, the guards roll out the red carpet and open the carriage doors. They are greeted by Constance, Alois, and Isaac. William steps out of the carriage and speaks of how they have not seen Constance in a long time. At this point, the protagonist and her assistants bow to the prince. Constance says that it has indeed been a long time since they have seen His Highness. Wilhelm sees that Constance, as always, in fine clothes and with her haughty character. Constance thinks about how it was only a few months ago. This guy was her soulmate. Constance can't believe it. But at the same time, Constance welcomes the prince into her domain. And the protagonist also welcomes Saint Sylvia. At that moment, Sylvia calls Miss Constance. The protagonist asks, "Is something wrong?" Sylvia asks if she's angry. After all, she's still worried. Constance thinks about the fact that when she found out that Sylvia did nothing for months instead of cleansing the earth, she of course freaked out. Constance replies that she didn't expect such a question, but she has no idea what she's mad about. Sylvia says that after all, she and Wilhelm already had a wedding, and Sylvia knows that Constance still loves the prince, and even if their marriage was annulled, Sylvia says she's really sorry. After all, she and Wilhelm love each other. So Sylvia asks that Constance not be jealous of them. At this point, Constance is very surprised that Sylvia thinks the protagonist is dying of undivided love. She doesn't understand what kind of lies Sylvia is telling. After all, from the beginning, Sylvia did not want to apologize not for shirking her work, nor for the inconvenience she caused the victims. She just wanted to show off her superiority. Constance turns to Saint and says that her relationship with the prince is over, and that the protagonist no longer has any feelings for the principal as a person. And she doesn't think anything will change. So she says that Sylvia can take it easy. Saint asks if Constance is sure Constance isn't mad, but Constance replies that she's not mad at all. But the protagonist lied. She's furious. Because while the two of them were having fun on their vacation, the town that belongs to the protagonist suffered incredible losses. Sylvia asks, "Is it then that Miss Constance no longer loves the prince and turns out so?" Saint does not think that Constance could have forgotten such a wonderful man in an instant. Oka. The protagonist apologizes to Saint Sylvia, but Constance doesn't understand what she needs to say to make Sylvia believe her. At that moment, Alois walks up to Lady Constance's hand and tells her that they should go. After all, the banquet is ready. Constance sees that Alois has helped her now. Constance turns to His Highness and Saint Sylvia and their subordinates. She says that everyone must be tired after traveling, so the protagonist asks permission to escort them to her estate. She tells everyone to follow her. At this point, Saint Sylvia turns to the prince and asks if he's interested in how hospitable Miss Constance is. After all, Sylvia can no longer wait for the banquet to begin. Constance realizes that a banquet is starting that will save them in honor of Saint Sylvia, the crown prince and his subjects. As Constance sorted out her feelings, but at the end, the real nightmare was to come. Meldorf's economy had always suffered. The damage it had suffered had broken all records this year. But despite that, they'd made the best meal possible. And even so, Constance turns to Saint Sylvia and talks about what they haven't finished yet. Sylvia says that venison is to her taste, but these herbs are not to her liking, and she won't eat it. That's why she left this behind. Meldorfian cuisine, and the ingredients are simple but flavorful, and the seasonings are just right. Saint Sylvia was a commoner, so she probably doesn't realize that leaving leftovers on a plate at a nobleman's banquet is unseemly. Constance realizes it pales in comparison to the food at the palace, but they have nothing better. But Constance tells them to be kind and finish their meal. After all, the protagonist needs to think of her subjects. She doesn't understand what the point of chilling here is. Sylvia doesn't understand what's going on. She says she didn't have to talk that way. She asks, is Constance being rude to her just because she hasn't eaten everything? She asks if food shouldn't be enjoyed. The protagonist doesn't understand what she should do with this girl because this way they won't move. Meanwhile, the people at the table can't believe that Constance is arguing with a saint. And now they are discussing the fact that the main character is not a good person. The banquet attendees are royal knights and ministers' children. They know the etiquette, but they turn a blind eye to her rudeness. Constance thinks about what she should do. She thinks of Alois. Constance thinks about the fact that she has to slow down, and the look on the guy's face is enough to realize that she should stop. Constance thinks about what Isaac is thinking right now. Could he be on Sylvia's side too? But when the protagonist looks at the guy, she realizes that everything is fine. And Isaac wasn't even paying attention. But at this time, she sees that Isaac has been watching Sylvia and all the time. He doesn't stop looking at her. Constance knew it. And Isaac was about to fall in love. At this rate, just like in the novel. At this point in Miss Constance asks why she would be so boiled over for some snack. And Sylvia says she will choose to eat or leave what she was served. She says girls don't need to get so angry. At this point, Sylvia starts to cry and tells the prince that she is scared. After all, Miss Constance is very rude. But the prince tells the girl that she shouldn't worry about Constance's words. The prince turns to Sophia and asks if she thinks she is speaking too much. He asks if Constance thinks it is against etiquette to force guests to do what they want. Constance replies that William is the crown prince, so she sees no reason in his words, and Saint Sylvia is his future consort. The prince doesn't think he's wrong, and it occurs to him that since Constance is jealous of Sylvia and has hated her since he dissolved their marriage, he asks, is Constance really that desperate? In fact, the protagonist is glad that they parted from the heart, and she didn't realize that the prince was so foolish, and she didn't notice while they were living together. Constance doesn't understand when the prince became a coward. After all, they loved each other. The prince says that if the protagonist dislikes it so much, they should do things differently. At this point, the prince takes a plate of food and throws it on the floor. The plate falls and breaks into pieces. William says that now Sylvia won't be able to finish what is broken and lying on the floor. At this time, Constance says that she thanks the prince and the saint for the banquet. She appreciates their attention, but the protagonist is angry because she personally paid for it all. The prince turns to the saint and asks if they can go to their rest. Sylvia agrees. Constance thinks about the fact that the prince and the saint do not show an ounce of respect to her citizens. On the contrary, they have no respect for them. After a while, the protagonist sits in her office, and she inhales from what she has very much recognized. Constance can't believe that these two are so hard to talk to. After all, they are so rude and stubborn. And so the girl wouldn't accept anyone but her minions. It hasn't even been 6 months since Constance left, but Wilhelm has become so intolerant in the meantime. The boy only sees Sylvia. It's more like he doesn't want to see anyone else. At this time, Alois walks in and tells the protagonist that this is even more tense than he thought. After all, this is the first time he's met them, but Alois didn't realize that these two were so stupid. What he means is that the prince and saint are such promiscuous people. Constance replies that the prince wasn't like that in the palace. His Highness was someone who was very sensitive when it came to people of lower status. Constance wonders what happened to him. Alois asks, "Doesn't it seem to Mistress that it's as if the prince is showing his real self now? People can't change that much in just 6 months. Anyway, the prince is a fiend for making the protagonist look like a villain." Constance looks at the guy and thinks about how his face looks like he's planning something. The protagonist turns to the guy and talks about the prince being at the manor. And she asks that Alois watch his language and think about what he says. Alois apologizes for saying such things. At this point, the protagonist is reviewing the papers and she is frozen in the moment. She thinks about whether or not this change could be due to the original novel. It could be true. There were scenes in the novel where Constance bullied Sylvia. As far as she remembers, one of the scenes took place while she and William were still betrothed. Constance horribly insulted the saint because she wasn't behaving properly at the banquet, and Wilhelm appeared on the stage and helped her. This was the scene that made the protagonist a villain. Even though the time in the novel was different, it happened the same way. And Constance just did what was required of her in her situation. Justice and evil are two sides of the same coin. And if a person's position changes and their thinking changes, everything changes. Constance thinks about the fact that Sylvia and the prince see things differently, and everything is going exactly as the writer intended. But there's no point in lamenting that now. The protagonist needs to focus on what's in front of her. Constance talks about how they're going to be busy starting tomorrow, and they can't force the saint to give up her job. And so they must just be patient until the purification is complete. Alois says the mistress is right. Constance talks about them going to the no-go zone early tomorrow morning, and so she's going to bed. The protagonist turns to the knight and asks if he can please meet with the head knight of His Highness's army to discuss the details. But at this point, the guy is very thoughtful. Constance calls out to the guy once more. Isaac apologizes for being distracted. He asks, "Does Constance really want him to have a secret meeting with the knight?" Constance says she would if possible. Isaac understands his lady's instruction. Constance thinks about how strange this is. After all, when Isaac is with her, he is always attentive, and Constance has never seen a guy so distracted. And to be distracted like this is atypical of his personality or work ethic. Constance asks, "Is Isaac not feeling well?" But the knight replies that he's fine. The guy bows to the protagonist and apologizes for disturbing her. Isaac goes to the meeting right away, and he apologizes again. He closes the doors. And Constance remembers that in the novel, Sylvia is the protagonist. And that's why everyone loves her romantic endeavors unconditionally. The story doesn't change based on that. And in this chapter, the love interest is Isaac. Everyone's thinking, is Sylvia really going to steal even her night away from her? The next day they leave early before dawn, and because the clearing zone was far away, but Sylvia has been asking since morning why they woke up so early. At this point, a maid comes in and addresses Saint Sylvia from behind. The prince approaches. William talks about how they are still tired after their trip, and they have just arrived. He asks, do and want to make them sag while doing so, and have not taken care of their health. After a while, the same maid comes to Lady Constance and says that she is sorry, but those were the prince's words. Constance realizes that there is a lot more trouble with these two than she thought. Constance is sure that they had fun all night. She can envision their positions. However, these two have kept them waiting a whole month for their arrival, and every second counts when it comes to destroying a country. Constance rises from her chair and says she will go. This time, Constance, along with her maid, knocks on the prince's room. The prince comes out and asks what they want this time. Constance apologizes to His Highness and Saint Sylvia for distracting them, but the protagonist says that the condition in the city is terrible, so every second counts. Constance talks about how while they wait here that contagion is spreading, it will take them a while to get there, so we should get going. But Sylvia doesn't understand what Constance is saying. And even if the protagonist says so, the saint is still tired after yesterday. And now Constance wants Sylvia to drive a long distance so early in the morning. Saint doesn't have the strength to clear anything. At this point, the prince approaches the girl and tells her that Sylvia is right. He asks, are they really ready to take full responsibility when Saint passes out during the purification? Constance realizes that purely theoretically their words make sense, but all Sylvia wants is to enjoy dating as many people as she wants. Constance says that of course Saint Sylvia's health is very important, and they have waited several months since seeking help while the spoilage grew. They have fitted out the carriage as comfortably as possible, and they have several breaks planned, so this journey won't be too difficult. Constance ducks in front of the prince and the saint. She asks that they start getting ready. By the time they finally got their forced consent, the sky was already bright. They set out on the road and the day is cloudy again. The road will take a little longer in this weather. Constance thinks about the fact that they also need to take breaks. So she doesn't even know when they will arrive. Judging by the plan, they should be there within 10 days. They are going to start at the very edge of the corrupted country and work their way to the middle of the sacred mountain, where the monsters came from to clear the cleft. Constance thinks about if she has time to herself, she will start her romantic relationship again, and they have made the plan very narrow. So Saint should have no time for that not. The main character didn't expect that it would start this way. Suddenly, the protagonist notices sudden sunlight. She looks out the window and doesn't realize what's going on, because the road on which they're driving through the only sunlit area. Constance thinks about whether it could be that they are being protected by a saint. The protagonist thinks about, is it a character's privilege that the writer god of the short story has fallen in love with? The protagonist sees Isaac riding nearby. She talks about how very strange the sky is. The knight replies that because of this weather, they should arrive earlier than they had planned. Constance agrees. The rot is spreading, so they had better arrive as early as possible. Constance realizes that it's the saint's fault that they left so late, but it's also because of her. They'll arrive earlier than planned. Constance thinks about how ironic it is, and then they arrive at their destination. Constance sees that not much snow has fallen yet. The servant talks about how there is much less snow than usual. Constance sees this man she met in town, and she is very glad that he looks good. The man shakes hands with his mistress and says he is mutually pleased. But more importantly, it is the spoiling that the protagonist thinks about. Constance sees that the situation has been getting worse ever since, and it has. Over the past few months, it has been slowly advancing and invading everything they can watch as it covers so much ground. Just like the wife and child of a forester. For if the damaged land is cleared, the seasons will change and the flowers will bloom. As long as people survive, they can start anything. But only if they survive. For the prince and Sylvia came too late, and these two are only sacrificing humans for their own selfish reasons. At this time, the woodsman asks where the saint is now. At this time, Sylvia rejoices that there is a great deal of light. She asks that Wilhelm touch it. When the prince touches the snow, he talks about the snow being cold, and Sylvia will catch cold if she continues to stand in it. North replies that she is fine. The girl has made a little snowman and asks the prince isn't that cute. Wilhelm says that it is very cute. Wilhelm takes the girl's hair in his hands and starts to look at it. He says that Sylvia is very pretty. Sylvia has heard a lot about the saint, but it looks like a rather strange person. Their current saint is pretty harmless. At this time, Constance notices that Isaac is breathing very heavily. The protagonist calls the knight, and Isaac apologizes to the girl. Constance doesn't understand. Is Isaac really interested in Sylvia? After all, at this time Sylvia is happy that there is a lot of snow. True, the protagonist is already sick of it. Constance claps her hands and says that they should get started. She asks if they can please be shown their closest spoiled neighborhood. The forester escorts them out and tells them to follow him. Constance sees that the spoil used to be very far away, but now it has reached that spot. Constance sees that the army is breathing heavily. Due to a deviation in the storytelling, the spoilage didn't affect the main character, but it sure smells awful. Constance tells everyone to move back, and she's about to get a little closer. Isaac starts yelling and telling Constance not to do it, but at that moment, Isaac stops, and Constance asks what happened. The knight replies that it doesn't stink to him. In fact, Isaac is standing very close to the spoil, but the air smells the same as usual. Constance thinks about whether it could also be the power of the saint. The forester takes a step and asks, "Has everyone noticed it too?" After all, when the saint arrived, the smell and the apathy of the people disappeared. The man says it took all his strength to stay conscious. But today he feels as if he's breathed fresh forest air for the first time before the spoil spread. Constance sees that the spoil and miasmas are being destroyed. At this time, Isaac continues to look at the saint. Constance sees it happening again, and Isaac continues to look at the series. Constance knew this would happen, and more importantly, instead of the tense, indifferent look of a knight that can even cause fear, Isaac's gaze is gentle as if he has seen and something dear, and there is a lovely and soft aura around him. Constance feels an incredible excitement. She does not understand why it is so. The girl even let a tear fall. She doesn't understand why her chest hurts so much. She turns to the knight and asks if he is listening to her. Isaac really doesn't feel no effects of the spoilage right now. Constance realizes that there is no mistake here, and Isaac is not who he used to be. Spoiled Earth has become such a blighted neighborhood that it's impossible to live in. It's a world bordering on death, and the only one who can cure it is Sylvia. The knights are discussing how the terrible stench has passed. They don't understand if it's thanks to the saint. At this time, the knight Isaac approaches Sylvia and talks about how this is a miracle from God, and that he's always heard. He never dreamed Sylvia would have such divine protection. He takes the girl's hand and kneels before her. Constance doesn't want to see this. She does not want to see such a knight. At this point, Sylvia turns to the protagonist and asks what happened to Miss Sophia. Did she feel the stare on her back? Sylvia asks if Constance might be dumbfounded by her power. The protagonist doesn't understand why Sylvia is enveloped in such a gorgeous, pure aura when she is completely addicted to romance. Constance thinks about the fact that no matter what kind of person Sylvia is, she is still a saint. Sylvia is the main character in the book, a saint who saved her country, and she is the most loved by the writer of this story. On the other hand, Constance is the villain in the story, and she cannot beat fate. However, she turns to the saint and asks, "Has Sylvia come to Meldorf to enjoy her vacation?" Constance asks that Sylvia fulfill her duties as a saint. The prince begins to get angry with the girl. But at that moment, Sylvia yells for everyone to stop, and everything is fine. Even though Constance has been nicknamed the villain, she needs to do her duty, and she needs to protect her city. Sylvia asks, "Does Constance even have Constance to clean up the country?" Constance replies that she will ask for it, and finally starts to approach the protagonist, and finally the cleansing begins. A strong wind begins to blow. No one realizes what is happening. Sylvia uses a ritual prayer, and there is a flash. A light snow appears in space, but it turns out to be a glow, a falling light that surrounds the series. It is very beautiful, and all the warriors are mesmerized by what is happening. Everyone present has their breath taken away. People can see that the light is beginning to cover the spoil. At this time, Sylvia turns and looks at the main character. She smirks and continues to do what she was doing. Suddenly, there is a very bright light that blinds everyone who is there. The warriors can't see anything. All the spoil that was eating the country is gone. People start to rejoice and say it's a miracle. They congratulate Sylvia because all the spoil is gone. As are the miasmas. The warriors can't believe it. It's all gone. Constance realizes that quite naturally, Isaac is crazy about the power of the saint. After all, the girl's power is real, and it's proof that she's the protagonist. The protagonist thinks about the fact that she's only a mistake, and no matter how hard Constance works for her country, she doesn't have the power to summon miracles from God. In the end, the protagonist only has the name Constance, and she is a minor character. And Isaac and the knights all don't care how much she is obsessed with romance or how much her personality is disgusting. Everyone needs Sylvia, not Constance. After everything happened, Saint approaches the protagonist and asks if Miss Constance is pretty now. Sylvia cleansed all the spoil she saw. The protagonist bows to the saint and thanks that the saint allowed her amazing power to be seen. Constance says it was marvelous. No matter how useless Constance is as a secondary character, this is no time to complain. And no matter what kind of person Sylvia is, her power is real, and no one else can do it but her. As the leader of this country, the fact that the spoil has been destroyed should please the main character more than anything. Sylvia talks about how Sophia has a lot of plans, but that's all she has to do for today. Sylvia asks if Constance would mind if she rested. The protagonist doesn't mind. Sylvia talks about how she woke up early, and they had a very long drive, and that's why she was exhausted. Constance talks about getting their tent ready at the campground. She says to let Saint rest before tomorrow. Sylvia says that naturally she wants to rest as soon as possible, so she asks for everything to be prepared quickly. Sylvia asks that Constance also make sure that her meat doesn't have a lot of spices in it. After all, if it's like that time, Sylvia won't be able to eat this one. Saint also asks that the meat be spiced like in the Gelvet of the imperial capital. At this time, the saint turns to Miss and asks if she has a bodyguard. Constance doesn't understand what the girl is talking about, but the saint talks about that tall man with dark hair and amber eyes. Constance realizes that the saint is talking about the knight Isaac. Saint talks about how Isaac has been looking at her strangely today. Also, this knight is very handsome and looks strong. Saint asks why this guy was losing his guardian girl. Constance isn't sure how to answer that, but when the prince's family disowned her, the protagonist's father chose a knight from the guard family, so that means Isaac is a Highland soldier. They are excellent soldiers from a company that is known nationwide for their strength. Saint says she's a little sorry that Isaac is with Constance, who His Majesty threw out for inappropriate behavior. After all, Saint doesn't even think Constance is a suitable employer for a knight. Constance begins to get angry, and clenching her fist, she turns to Saint Sylvia and talks about how she is not sure what Saint is trying to say in this way. The saint begins to scoff and talks about Constance taking care of her tent and dinner. Constance realizes that they don't have a cook, and so they did their best to turn their limited supplies into table food. After a while, Saint says she is full, but her plate was full of food. Constance asks, "Didn't she enjoy it?" Sylvia replies that of course not because she's glad they used less spices. But now the flavor of the meat is too strong. The prince is also getting angry and says that Saint has done her part and is tired. He asks how they could have given her such unpalatable food. Saint gets up from the table and talks about how she has eaten everything, so she will be going to her tent. Constance thinks about the fact that their purification trips will continue after this, and she shouldn't argue because she needs Saint to continue with the purification ritual. Constance apologizes, and they'll do much better tomorrow. The saint says that will undoubtedly be the case since she wants them to do it. But also, the bodyguard she mentioned earlier was looking at her all through dinner. Sylvia asks if by any chance her boyfriend is interested. Sylvia asks if Miss Constance would like Miss Constance to tell to the boyfriend. Sylvia asks that Constance tell the knight that Saint wants to save the knight, and she would be interested in talking to him so that the saint is opposed to the knight coming to her tent later. The girl asks that Constance make sure she says this to the guy. Constance goes to her tent and wonders what she should do about all this. After all, it has been months since Isaac left town to go with her. And it hasn't been that long since Isaac has always been faithful and never forgotten his role as a knight. Since Saint arrived in the town that belongs to the main character, the change in him was evident. This proves that the persuasive power of the novella works. So if the protagonist tells the knight to go to the saint, then Isaac will fall in love with her, as he should, and they'll fall in love. But Constance doesn't want that, and she won't give the knight girl. Constance wants to dispel all the girl's desires. But the country can only be saved by the power of the saint, and if Meldorf comes first for Sophia, there is only one choice, and otherwise Constance will lose both Isaac and the city. Constance realizes that either way, everything exactly depends on how Isaac will do, and Constance can only trust the knight. After a while, the protagonist walks into the knight's tent and tells him that she needs to talk to him about something. She asks that Isaac come in to see her. Constance sees that the knight's gaze is intense and his face is cold but also beautiful. And the knight's body is chiseled manly and radiates charm. Constance understands why the author wants Isaac to go to Sylvia and why the knight wants the girl. The knight asks what Miss Constance wanted to talk to him about. The protagonist tells the knight to listen to her carefully, because the saint wants Isaac to visit her today. And Sylvia says she wants to save the knight from the villain protagonist. The saint wants to talk to the knight, so she asked him to come to her tent. And Constance frankly talks about how she doesn't want the knight to go there, but she can't deny her request for the sake of the city. Constance realizes she's the worst, but if she upsets Sylvia, then her city is finished, and she is responsible for her country. She can't abandon her people, and there's nothing she can do but offer the knight as a human sacrifice. Constance thinks about the fact that it looks like she really is the villain. The protagonist apologizes to the knight because she's sorry for being such a cowardly leader. But Isaac says Miss Constance has nothing to worry about, but the protagonist knows that the knight will fall in love with the saint. At that moment, Constance takes the guy's face with her hand and asks that Isaac listen to her. After all, no matter what happens, the only one the knight answers to. It's Constance and no one else. Because Isaac is her knight, and he belongs only to her. Constance tells the knight never to forget that. Isaac says he understood everything Constance told him, and he takes the girl's hand and kisses her hand. Isaac says that the girls have nothing to worry about. The guy gets up off his knees and bows to his mistress. He says he is leaving. Constance realizes that even though the knight said it, she knows Isaac will fall in love with the saint. The Almighty Creator uses all his power to take everything from her villainess. First he took the crown prince and then her status as Marcus's daughter. And now the knight Isaac is taken from the protagonist. Constance starts crying and talking about how she has nothing else. She doesn't realize how much more she has to lose to be forgiven. Constance thinks about how tired she is. The girl lies down on the bed thinking about what, if this was her only way out. The sight of the departing knight sticks in her memory. After all, in the story, the knight Isaac had asked why he had to fulfill that role. The girl tried to stop the boy, but Alois had told her that Constance had lost one of her best knights. And that was stupid. Alois then turned around and walked away too. Constance tried to stop the guy, but he walked away. Constance is very sad because of the fact that knight Isaac should be on the saint's side, and the girl as a villain was kicked out of Meldorf, and the saint and the men who lived happily ever after. At this point, Constance wakes up and realizes that all these memories were just a bad dream. She goes outside and talks about being cold. She remembers the night and thinks about the fact that this dream woke her up. Suddenly, the girl hears a whistling sound from the wind. The light of the moon illuminates the quiet town, and Constance must protect the town. When the protagonist looked at the sky after a while, she decides that she must keep going. After all, still she won't sleep even if she goes back now. As Constance walks through the tents, suddenly she hears someone's voice. She turns around and sees that Isaac is sitting there. The protagonist runs up to the guy and asks what's wrong. The heroine can't understand what the knight is doing here since he's freezing to death. Constance feels that the guy smells of liquor and his odor is so strong that the girl is sick of it. Constance asks the boy if he's all right. But when the knight sees his mistress, he starts to smile. He asks what Constance is doing out on the street so late at night. The knight hugs the main character. He says it would be bad if Constance was cold. He takes off his cloak and tells Constance to put it on. But the heroine tells Isaac not to do that because she's fine, and Isaac is the only one who's frozen. Constance can't imagine Isaac ever getting so drunk. Constance apologizes to the knight because she's sorry. After all, she made the boy do something he shouldn't have done. But Isaac replies that it's okay. He grabs the girl's hand and says that he just had too much to drink. It's been a very long time since Isaac has gotten really drunk. He says it was after the Battle of Groain. But everything is fine now. Isaac says he wasn't too drunk. But Constance cries out that the knight is not telling the truth because he is very drunk. She asks why the knight is so drunk. But Isaac replies that the prince forced him to be with the saint. But he refused. So instead, the prince ordered him to get drunk, and it ended with Constance finding him on a cold night. Constance asks that the knight tell her what happened. But Isaac replies that the prince forced him to be with the saint. But he refused. So instead, the prince ordered him to get drunk, and it ended with Constance finding him on a cold night. Constance asks that the knight tell her what happened. Isaac says that even though saints saved their town, and it was the prince's orders, he couldn't agree to it. Constance says that she doesn't understand their meaning in the first place. After all, the prince and the saint had behaved like animals, and the knight was disgusted. Constance realizes that there is no way she can justify the prince. Isaac says that Miss Constance has been frightened all this time. He asks what it is that the girl is afraid of. The knight says that it upsets him because he can't defeat something that can make one suffer so much. He is the mistress's protector, and she has been in pain all this time.